At the beginning of the movie, a team of U.S. Navy SEALs headed by Lieutenant Commander Karen Greer collaborate with Ritter from the CIA to rescue a CIA operative taken hostage by a local military group in Aleppo, Syria. The Navy SEALs are dismayed that Ritter couldn't give them the whole story behind the operative's capture due to the high sensitivity of the case, but nonetheless follow him as he leads them to a dilapidated building that's believed to house the suspects. They catch the suspects by surprise. They successfully carry out their attack and find the hostage. Then, as they rescue the CIA operative, Senior Chief Petty Officer John of the Navy SEALs takes stock of his surroundings and is troubled to realize that most of the equipment and weapons are Russian. He raises the issue with Ritter, who ignores him and rushes them to leave. The American soldiers start to escape, but run into heavy fire. Lieutenant Commander Karen is pinned and surrounded by the local military. Despite the order of Ritter to evacuate the premises, Petty Officer John searches for his commander and friend, finds her, and helps her escape. As they make their escape, they're horrified to realize that the building was a Russian military depot and is not owned by the local militia as they were led to believe. Then, a chopper collects all the American soldiers, and they leave for their country. During the flight, a fight breaks out between Ritter and Petty Officer John, as the latter accuses the former of having knowledge of the Russia involvement, and the rest try their best to break it off. 3 months later, all the soldiers are living with their families in America. In Washington, D.C., Petty Officer John attends a party with his 8 months pregnant wife, Pam. Later that night, the couple returns home, and Pam turns in for the night, while Petty Officer John goes downstairs to listen to some music. Moments later, their electric power goes off. Alarmed, Petty Officer John goes to check out what's going on, but is ambushed by masked hitmen before he could even make it up the stairs. While he fights off and shoots the intruder, another man runs to the bedroom to shoot and kill Pam and the baby. Petty Officer John tries to get to Pam, but he's under heavy fire from the hitmen. He shoots and kills all of the intruders, except for one, but is gravely injured in the process. The surviving hitman manages to escape. Petty Officer John crawls to his bedroom and is anguished to see Pam has been fatally injured. Then he passes out from his injuries. First responders arrive and take the officer, who is barely clinging to life, to the hospital. After many treatments and close follow-ups, Petty Officer John beats all of the odds and survives. Ritter holds a meeting with senior government officials and Lieutenant Commander Karen, in which he reveals 2 other members of the Special Ops team from the Syria mission have been attacked and killed in the last 24 hours. Then, Secretary of Defense Thomas Clay, despite Ritter's resistance, invites Lieutenant Commander Karen to CIA headquarters in Langley to join him and Ritter in a briefing. During the meeting, Ritter admits that the attacks on the soldiers were solicited by the Russians, but takes the stance that the CIA considers the case closed and will no longer support an investigation into it, as they don't want it to escalate any further. Lieutenant Commander Karen is furious and suspicious of Ritter, and so she does her own investigation. She then finds out that the chief of intel, with a known past connection with the Russians, named Andrei Vasilyev, had issued the passports to the now identified intruders. Petty Officer John decides to reach Andrei, no matter how evasive he is, so that he can learn the identity of the intruder that escaped from his house the night of the attack. A few days later, Petty Officer John follows Andrei as he rushes to the airport to get out of the country. The officer blocks Andrei's car, which leads multiple cars to crash and pile up in the streets. During the resultant commotion, Petty Officer John enters Andrei's car, holds Andrei at gunpoint, and asks him for the name of the surviving intruder. After learning that the surviving Russian's name is Viktor Rykov, the officer kills Andrei and gives himself up to the police. Lieutenant Commander Karen goes to the prison to visit Petty Officer John. There, he tells her what happened and asks her to arrange a meeting with the Secretary of Defense, where the officer could negotiate the exchange of valuable information for his freedom. The Lieutenant Commander is not very optimistic, but promises to try. Later that day, Petty Officer John learns that the prison is full of Russian mobs, which reminds him that he doesn't have much time to do the deal with the Secretary of Defense. Hence, he fakes an emergency in his cell, and when the SWAT team comes to respond, he attacks them and holds one hostage. He then threatens to kill the hostage unless someone can connect him with the Secretary of Defense. The prison officials and guards are confused and don't know how to proceed. Out of desperation, they contact Lieutenant Commander Karen and explain the situation. She uses this as an opportunity to show the severity of the situation to the Secretary of Defense and arranges for a meeting. Moments later, Petty Officer John is safely escorted out of the prison to an army base nearby to attend a meeting with the Secretary of Defense, CIA Director Sarah, Ritter, and Lieutenant Commander Karen. In the meeting, Petty Officer John shares the name he learned from Andre and is astonished to see the CIA's and Secretary of Defense's terrified reaction. Ritter then explains that Victor is well known for his pro-Soviet, anti-Western beliefs, in which he reasons that the best way to bring the collapse of the Western world is by causing chaos and attacking Westerns on their own land. Following this brief, he has been linked to several attacks on Americans on American soil. CIA Director Sarah adds that following the many tragedies he caused, Victor has been sanctioned and a few years later killed. However, Petty Officer John is insistent that he has the right information and that Victor was one of the men that attacked him in his house and managed to escape. To put matters to rest, Ritter arranges for a photo lineup and asks Petty Officer John to identify Victor. When the officer correctly identifies him, the group is once more shocked and worried at the implications. Then, Secretary of Defense Thomas forms a task force to go to Murmansk, Russia, where Victor is known to base his operations from, and extract him. He asks Lieutenant Commander Karen to head the task force, and despite her fierce advice against, accepts Petty Officer John's plea and allows him to join. The Secretary of Defense also reminds the Petty Officer that once finished with the mission, he will no longer be a soldier and that he will be sent back to prison as a felon. The Secretary of Defense then decides for them to use a commercial plane instead of a military plane, so that they can pass into the Russian airspace without causing alarm. Ritter decides to travel separately, while the rest of the task force take the modified commercial plane and plan to jump from it into the Barents Sea, which is in Russian airspace territory. During the flight, Petty Officer John shares with Lieutenant Commander Karen how much he regrets being involved in the Syrian operation, as his family might have still been safe otherwise. The Lieutenant Commander comforts and supports him, emphasizing on how he shouldn't blame himself for what happened to his family. She also adds that she doesn't think that the officer is in the right mind for a mission, and they get into an argument. Then, as the plane gets over the Barents Sea, the task force soldiers prepare to jump out, but are intercepted by a Russian military plane that asks them to return as they have trespassed illegally. The Americans refuse to comply and try to buy some time, but the Russians attack them, and the plane crashes into the sea. The American soldiers barely survive and manage to get out of the wreckage. Petty Officer John stays behind and rescues the gears for their mission. From the Barents Sea, they use a boat to get to Murmansk. As they collect themselves in Murmansk, Petty Officer John starts questioning how the Russians figured out the disguise of the commercial plane and why Ritter was the only member of the task force that happens to be on a different plane, which leads him to believe that Ritter sold them out to the Russians. To make matters worse, when the task force team gets to their mission warehouse, they find Ritter speaking to some Russians and holding a bag full of money. At the sight of this, Petty Officer John attacks Ritter until Ritter explains that he has assumed all the task force members were dead and was just trying to get local help in capturing Victor. Petty Officer John gives Ritter the benefit of the doubt, and they set off on the mission, as they had just been informed that Victor has been seen in an apartment building. They get there, led by Petty Officer John, and charge towards Victor's apartment. However, they are confused to see all his security men dead at the door. When they enter the apartment, they see Victor wearing a suicide vest, and when they start to retreat, he tells them that he was a former CIA agent and claims that they are all pawns serving the same king, America. Before they could ask him for an explanation, he detonates the bomb and blows himself up and half of the building. Immediately after the explosion, the task force soldiers get pinned down and take heavy fire from all directions, including from outside the door. As the task force soldiers, including Ritter, try to fight back, it dawns on them that the attack on the Navy SEALs, the dead Russian soldiers in America, and the extraction mission are all part of a setup to start a war between America and the Soviet Union, and that the task force is just a pawn in the scheme. Determined to survive, Petty Officer John distracts the Russian police and soldiers that responded to the commotion as the rest escape, reasoning that he doesn't have much to get back to, other than a lengthy term in prison. Once the team successfully gets away, Petty Officer John fights intensely with the Russian military, disguises himself, and makes it out to get to the team's warehouse safely. Then, the team arranges for a boat and leaves Russia. Ritter gives money to Petty Officer John and tells him to work in the background to find out who's really behind the setup, while officially being declared dead. The Petty Officer John apologizes to him for judging him the wrong way. After a few weeks, Petty Officer John ambushes Secretary of Defense Thomas and forces him into the car. There, he confirms his suspicion that he was the orchestrator traitor and demands to know the reasons. The Secretary of Defense confesses that he was just trying to boost his country's economy and to give the nation a common enemy to unite against. Petty Officer John records this and drives the car off the bridge. He watches the Secretary of Defense drown and swims out just in time. Ritter takes the recording to CIA Director Sarah and bargains a new identity for Petty Officer John Kelly as John Clark. John Clark leaves to start a new life. The end. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.